Hi, everyone. This is Noor. I'm the founder of Love Addicts. We're a community of people with anxious attachment. And welcome to this interview with Dr. Howard Steele. Dr. Howard is a professor of psychology. He's a director of graduate studies, and he's the co-director of the Center for Attachment Research at the New School for Social Research in New York City. So welcome, Dr. Howard. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about attachment today.
Thank you very much, Nora. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me just clarify one thing. I'm no longer the Director of Graduate Studies. That's been rolled into another position.
Okay.
But one thing about me that's relevant, I lived in London, England for 18 years, from 1986 till 2004, and have been in New York City since then at the New School for Social Research. And in London, I had the good fortune of meeting John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory.
Wow.
And also in London, I started a journal called Attachment and Human Development, and we're in our 25th year at the moment. And then further note, I started a learned society back in 2011 called the Society for Emotion and Attachment Studies. So I'm a attachment researcher, and in the field of attachment, there are very interesting questions about how to measure attachment. And we measure it differently at different ages, and it means something different across the lifespan.
Mhm.
But I think for your listeners and your questions, you're mostly thinking about romantic attachments in adulthood.
Correct.
And I'm happy to speak about those. Those have principally been investigated by social psychologists. And I should mention that I'm a developmental psychologist. But with that background and caveat, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm actually, before I dive right into the questions, I'm very curious. What was it like to meet John Bowlby?
Well, it was very thrilling. At the time, I was in my late 20s, beginning my doctoral work, and he had these big white bushy eyebrows. And I would meet with him typically at the Tavistock Clinic in London, where an alternative psychoanalytic theory called the Kleinian model is very prevalent. So he didn't have a lot of visitors. He was rather isolated in his professional base. And yet his office was kind of a hub, a central place where everybody would send their work to get his feedback. So he knew many people in the field and was a pleasure to interact with. He himself said about his own experience that there was a very painful separation when he was 4 years old because he was cared for by a nanny for the first 4 years of his life.
Hmm.
And then she left the family home and he was quite upset. And he would say about it that it was a damaging experience, but nothing so damaging as to prevent him from pursuing a career in the study of separation and loss, where he made enormous contributions that have influenced my work over the decades.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah. So, Dr. Steele, you mentioned a lot about attachment being, that we deal with that in the context of romantic relationships, whereas what you're doing is more so related to actual attachment and the sense of developmental psychology. And I feel like romantic relationships and attachment in that sense is very much related to developmental attachment. And what do you have to say about that? How does that develop?
Sure. Well, attachment initially develops between the newborn human infant and the people who care for the infant and hopefully love the infant, want to protect the infant, want to show that they're stronger, wiser, and kinder than the infant. And when that happens, infants typically develop what are called secure attachments.
Mhm.
And the securely attached infant, when they're distressed, has only one question in mind. Where's mother? Where's father? Where's grandmother? That person who I know I can rely on. But for the anxiously or insecurely attached infant, they have at least two questions in mind.
Mhm.
Where is mother, father, the nearest figure who could offer support? And what is their state of mind? What's going on with them? Because sometimes I'm frightened of them. Sometimes I'm unsure how helpful they'll be. And that of course is um, a troubling thing because all of us, infants, children, adolescents, adults, are limited in our attentional capacities. So if I have to spend a lot of attentional strength getting the attention of my caregiver, and I don't know if they're going to be there for me, that's an anxiety-provoking situation.
Mm.
And if I'm thinking that I'm afraid of the caregiver, it's a disorganizing situation. Bowlby said that the normal response to loss is disorganization and disorientation. Disorganization, not sure where you are, and disorientation, not sure what's happening and when it is. And we know across the globe that when people suffer loss, especially a sudden loss of a loved one, we don't expect them to work. We don't expect them to do much. We know that they're grieving, and if we care about them, we offer support. We offer food. We offer support, driving, picking up their children, coming to help them make that transition from loss of a loved one that's very overwhelming and disorganizing and disoriented to a reorganization, so that the person who suffered a loss can focus 3, 6, 9 months later on the living loved ones, and let the memory of the dead loved one occupy a special place in memory. That is no longer a daily, hour by hour, minute by minute upset. That's really central to the attachment perspective, because what John Bowlby did was he said, let's look at actual interactions between children and caregivers, and the patterns that you know and your listeners know: avoidance, anxious avoidance, anxious resistance, security, disorganization. Those are infant patterns. And the social psychologists in the mid-1980s said, maybe those patterns exist in romantic attachment relationships. And they started to talk about types of adult people in romantic attachments, that someone might have an anxious attachment, avoidant, or resistant. But, in the current day, 40 years after that effort was done, we now know that romantic relationships have their own dynamic, and parent-child relationships have a different dynamic. Parent-child relationships are about protecting the child so they can grow to be a healthy person capable of entering, establishing, maintaining relationships with family, starting new relationships with friends. But romantic attachment is about procreation in part. From the point of evolution, we need attachment in infancy to protect us. In young adulthood, we need romantic attachments to afford us the opportunity, perhaps, to procreate and have a child of our own. So romantic attachment is something around assortative mating and reproduction. Parent-child attachment is all about development. Now, Bowlby did think there might be continuity. And if there's no difference in the context or environment of our childhood, and the parents behave similarly toward us over the whole first 20 years of our life, and I don't know, we go to the local high school, we go to the local university, there's a lot of continuity. There may be continuity from childhood into romantic attachments, but it's rare, because the world is changing all the time. Just look at what we've been through in the last 5 years.
Right.
It's a different world. And we talk about cohort effects and the fact that the group that we're born with, we share certain characteristics with them, but there's a lot of variation as well. And over time, we change. So I really don't like the idea to talk of an anxious adult, an avoidant or anxious adult, because I might be high on anxiety on a Friday and less so 4 or 5 days or 4 months later. So I think change is common. So is continuity. And we need to look at what makes for continuity and what makes for change in relationships. Because, of course, I think your listeners will immediately recognize, I just want to have one question in mind. When I'm upset with my partner, I want to be able to turn to them. But some people, when they're upset with their partner, think, no, I better not upset them. I'm going to keep this inside. I'm going to avoid telling them this because it would upset them. The anxious adult, by the same token, might not share their concerns with their relationship partner. They might not want to overwhelm them. But a healthy romantic attachment is all about sharing, being curious about what's going on in the mind of the other, not being confident that you know what's in your own mind or the other, but you want to engage in conversation to find out. And as I tell my young adult children, when you choose a partner, don't just think of the immediate future, because romantic attachments begin with infatuation. They begin with passion. Now, hopefully, there will be passion in the relationship over the full course of the relationship, if it lasts 5 years or 50 years, but many other things come into play in romantic attachments: loyalty, cooperation, co-parenting, so many aspects of love that are not about romance and passion. We know, I was at a conference recently discussing mentor and mentee relationships. Everybody works in a company or a place where they have a supervisor. If that's a good relationship, the supervisor will bring out the best in the person that they're supervising. That doesn't always happen. There's tension in those relationships. But when it goes well, there's an element of love in that relationship that's all about respect and admiration, not necessarily intimate contact. So I think it's very helpful to talk about all the many different types of love in adult relationships. Romance is one, but there are many other aspects to full multidimensional relationships.
Right. So a lot of the attachment, what you're saying, is not really centered only around the romantic part, but there's also the different aspects like loyalty, communication, and so on that make up for a healthy relationship.
Well, that's right. And the toxic element in romantic attachments is when you're afraid of your partner. If you're
Avoidance.
if that's the main emotion that you feel toward your partner, fear, it's probably not a good relationship to remain in. And you'd probably be advised. One doesn't want to give advice to people you don't know, but it may be a sign that the relationship is not a great one to continue with. Might be advised to get out of that situation, because it's a damaging and toxic experience to be afraid of the person that you love.
Right. And so it's a lot about the relationship itself as well, not necessarily just the one person that's in it. And so with that said, what do you say to the people who might feel like they are perhaps anxious and there's this pattern in multiple relationships and they find it a little bit hard to get out of a relationship that might be toxic to them because of, their anxious coping strategy when it comes up?
Well, I think that it's hard to get out of relationships because they're familiar to us, and there's a certain safety and familiarity. And of course, if you're afraid of somebody, you probably have self-doubts. How could I manage on my own without them? So it is all about acknowledging your vulnerability and taking chances. Now, it might be that you want to seek out some kind of counseling to help with the relationship. If the partner agrees to participate, change is possible. But if that's not working, you might want to reach deep inside and be the adult for yourself and put your arm around the child within who's feeling afraid and frightened and say, I'm here now. I'm going to take care of you, and we're going to get out of this difficult situation. There's people who are there who are going to support us. You typically don't leave a damaging situation because it's familiar unless you see an alternative. So that you need both. You need the sense, this isn't working for me. This looks like it will work better. And then but then you go in the new situation, you find it's all happening again. That might be a time to reach out to a counselor, a therapist, a friend who you trust. Life is long and there's lots of opportunity to change. And the best way to think about the adult romantic attachments is its dimensions. All of us feel some level of avoidance in close relationships. All of us feel some level of anxiety. Those who are low on anxiety and low on avoidance, that's your secure group. And if you're low on anxiety and low on avoidance, then you have lots of interactions colored by joy, by mutual understanding, by hope, by plans for the future, and looking back and having a shared understanding of past shared experiences. Those are all very wonderful feelings that people ought to be able to experience in their close romantic attachments.
Yeah. One interesting thing that I notice a lot in the community and then people who, talk about this is oftentimes that people who are high on avoidance and then people who are high on anxious attachment or high on anxiety tend to attract each other. They tend to find each other, or maybe just find each other and stay together. Do you have any idea why that happens? What's the explanation of that?
Of people who stay together?
Of generally people who are high on avoidance and then high on and attracting people who are high on anxiety, and they tend to find each other quite a lot.
Well, they do, and it depends on the level of avoidance and the level of anxiety. Someone with a little bit of avoidance might find somebody with a little bit of preoccupation a suitable partner, because that little bit of preoccupation compels the anxious person to take chances, to share their negative feelings, to warm the other one up. And the person with a little bit of avoidance might welcome that. They might think, oh, wow, I don't have to stay away from this person. They want closeness and I can enjoy that. So I think what you're commenting upon is one pattern of close romantic relationships, as I say, where someone has a little bit of anxiety and the other person has a little bit of avoidance. But I'm not aware of very, very high avoidance. Somebody with very, very high avoidance is going to find it difficult to form and maintain long-term close romantic relationships. And somebody very, very high on anxiety is going to push people away. Because the definition of anxiety in close romantic relationships is all about not being able to talk freely to the partner.
Not feeling safe with them.
Yeah. And high anxiety is all about wanting more than your partner's giving and then getting angry with them for not giving it.
Right.
So at the high end, very high anxiety or very high avoidance, that is going to be a challenge. And people are going to have to listen to your show, learn from you and learn from people you interview. And again, it's through new relationships that we modify our old patterns. And engaging in a new relationship is a challenge, but we have to meet that challenge if we're going to change.
Right. So you would say, is it a necessary component for someone to change their attachment style or their general spectrum on the avoidance or anxiety trait? Is it necessary for them to be in a new relationship or to find a new relationship?
I think so. But the starting point is acknowledging one's vulnerability, acknowledging that one feels avoidant, that one feels anxious, preoccupied. And if you can acknowledge that, you can talk to others about it, and you can, with time, diminish those negative experiences of anxiety or avoidance through new relationships, new interactions with a counselor, a therapist, a friend, a romantic partner, maybe a family member.
Right. So a lot of what you're saying is a lot of the healing process involves initially just awareness and acknowledging that this is what I'm struggling with. And then
I think it's also relevant here to acknowledge that people have unrealistic ideals for their romantic attachments.
That's a good one.
And the movies and the culture feeds us those unrealistic ideals as if we're happy all the time. And that's not what attachment theory John Bowlby assumed. He wrote about the importance of having a healthy sense of anxiety and a healthy sense of guilt. Social life depends on people feeling anxiety and guilt. Guilt stops us from behaving badly. We have an ideal in our mind of how we ought to behave to feel good about ourselves, to be respected by the people we care for. And we know that if we violate those ideals, we're going to get into trouble. So we don't, because we would feel guilty if we did violate those ideals. Similarly, a certain amount of anxiety is important because it's a signal telling us, wow, What am I worried about? Who
Yeah.
can I talk to about my worries?
Yeah.
Oh, I can talk to my partner. That feels good. So healthy romantic relationships are not people who are in love and happy with one another 24/7. They're people who have all kinds of disagreements, misunderstandings, or ruptures, but they act quickly to repair those disagreements, misunderstandings, or ruptures. The rupture is followed by a quick repair, and the repair feels good and makes us believe that we can meet the next misunderstanding in a similar way by having a conversation with the partner, by finding out what's going on, and perhaps saying, I'm sorry, but really meaning it. And everyone listening to this will know that if you're upset with another person, it's not a good thing to say that, I demand an apology. You don't
Yeah.
want to make demands on people that you're upset. You hope that the person you're upset with will be able to hear you and what your deep feelings are.
Hmm.
Um, there's that social psychologist, I think Brene Brown, who's enormously popular because she talks about vulnerability as the source of strength.
Right.
I agree. I agree. A strong romantic attachment will be people who have vulnerabilities, know what those are, share those experiences with their partner, and feel helped and supported by the interaction with the other. Um, there's got to be some joy in a relationship if it's going to be maintained, and it should be the prominent feeling. But there'll be lots of other feelings that are negative that have to do with sadness, distress, fear. But all of those things are capable to deal with if you've got a kind of bedrock of shared understanding and joy and recovery, repair.
Yeah. And for couples who have, they're trying to get to that point, they're trying to get to that shared understanding and that bedrock, what advice would you give them to be able to get to that level of having that security in their relationship?
Well, I'm not a couples therapist, Yeah, I'm sure you've interviewed others, and it's couples therapists who will tell you about the strategies they have. But the strategy is to not attempt a complete resolution of all difficulty in one conversation,
Mhm.
but start with mini goals, little goals, little steps where you are open to listening to the other, open to affirming them, thanking them. The very destructive thing for romantic relationships is when one or both partners feel a sense of contempt for the other. That's toxic. And Gottman has shown that visual and there's subtle facial signals that indicate contempt and disgust.
Oh,
And when that's present in a relationship, it's a predictor of breakup. It's a predictor of divorce, separation, and divorce. So contempt is a very destructive emotion because it shows no respect for the other person.
yeah. And yeah, I could totally see that. It's a lot about not showing respect, but also perhaps not showing trust anymore when that emotion is out there between a couple.
I
Yeah.
think that's right. And there's a lot of discussion in the attachment world at the moment around trust, what's called epistemic trust,
Hmm.
that we seek knowledge of the world around us and we accept information from people we trust. And that becomes our knowledge base. So we want partners to trust in us because we'll be able to share information with them that they may feel is useful. And we hope that we can trust them and take on advice that they're giving. I'll just say that I have a big difficulty with attachment parenting. If any of your listeners or think that that's what I do, I
Hmm.
think that's a misguided idea
Hmm.
because people who advocate attachment parenting, or some probably do it for couple relationships, everything you do with your partner, with your child, you should do out of joy. It ain't so. Lots of feelings we have in close romantic attachments, parent-child attachments, child toward parent, parent toward child is negative emotion. the kinds of things we've been talking about that make for misunderstanding and rupture. So then the challenge is to repair the rupture quickly if possible. So security of attachment, high functioning romantic attachments is all about the doors being open for communication, and each partner is willing to reconsider their position in order to come to a new shared understanding that brings the couple closer.
So it's a lot about, it's not that there will be no problems, it's that there will be problems, but what will really make or break a couple is their ability to repair when a problem like that occurs. And
we'll find a commitment to finding solutions together.
So working as a team rather than working as two different opposite enemies, perhaps.
Well, that's right. And it's complicated and demanding, and it involves a lot of attention, because there's a risk that one person will feel, I'm giving up too much to protect and save this relationship. So then the other person will say, well, you're giving that up, but I'm giving this up. You gotta seek some kind of parity in the negotiations with your partner.
Yeah. A lot of what I also kind of pick up on in this talk is that there seems to be many different beliefs that we have, not just about ourselves, but also about relationships. So one belief that you kind of touch a little bit on is the belief that this relationship has to be perfect, or there should be no problems at all. What are your thoughts on beliefs that people perhaps who are high on anxiety or even high on avoidance have about themselves and about relationships? And in addition to that, what are healthy beliefs that we could have that could help us become and feel more secure?
Sure. Well, the goal for everyone ought to be to arrive at a conclusion about the self and others that includes the sense, I am lovable and I can love others. Now, that's a hard thing to say. I am lovable and I know how to love others. Love, as I suggested earlier, is a multidimensional concept, including passion, loyalty, affection, sensuality, sexuality, shared understanding, alliance, and, as I said, the capacity to resolve quickly and effectively inevitable difficulties. So that's the goal. Question is, how do we get there? Ideally, we get there from a situation where somebody loved us well when we were small children, and that stayed with us. And so we had an enduring belief in our inherent worth. But for a lot of people, that didn't come from childhood experiences, and it's something they have to acquire through later relationships, maybe with a sibling, maybe with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. Hopefully there's someone in a child's life that can signal to them what it feels like to be in a meaningful, supportive, mutual understanding. We should talk a little bit about loss and trauma, because that's a very destabilizing, those two things are destabilizing forces in human life. And for someone with a highly anxious attachment, there is a small but statistical link to unresolved loss. So everybody should think about their history of exposure to trauma and loss. Because I sign up with the idea that depression, anxiety, all those, there's 300 different diagnoses in the American Psychiatric Association nomenclature for diagnosing problems. I take the view that most of those are related to loss and trauma experiences. And that the problem with that is that if we've had a significant loss experience or a trauma, unfortunately, some people have repeated traumatic experiences. For people who want to tell that story, sometimes before it's well processed, they have to go back into the situation and they feel all the overwhelming fear and upset again. So they don't go there. And so we know that PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, is about numbing oneself, avoiding the painful memory, but being flooded by the painful memory at other times. And these are called situationally accessible memories. If I remember that time when I had the car accident, I'm back in the situation and I'm overwhelmed with fear.
Hmm.
But if I can take that memory, which is associated with amygdala activation in the brain, perhaps you've talked about that with other guests, that there's a little almond-shaped thing in the center of our brain that signals fear. But sitting on top of that is a much larger brain part called the hippocampus,
Hmm.
where memories are formulated. And if the traumatic or loss experience can be processed into a consolidated memory, then it becomes a verbally accessible memory that we can share without going back into the situation.
Hmm.
So making a distinction, it's Chris Bruin's idea, the distinction between situationally accessible memories and verbally accessible memories. So talking about our feelings is half the way to gaining control of them. Talking about our traumatic experiences enough, we can talk about it so that it acquires the characteristics of belonging to the past when it happened. The
Hmm.
present, 2 years, 20 years after, I'm no longer overwhelmed by that experience. It's a memory. I have it on my shoulder. I have it in my library of the mind. I can pull it down and look at it when I want, but it doesn't interfere with my day-to-day functioning or my current romantic attachment relationship. That's the goal. It takes time and effort.
So someone really has to sit down with themselves, figure out what loss, what trauma they've been through, and try to basically uncover it and talk about it so that it becomes part of the past and no longer something that is hidden inside of them and being suppressed, essentially.
I think I agree. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And, you mentioned loss and trauma being something that's very tied to how we feel our anxious attachment. What do you say about building resilience and strengthening oneself against future loss, against future trauma, perhaps against depression that might be also a product of the anxious attachment?
Thanks. I mean, I've written about this, and we believe that this capacity to talk about our thoughts and feelings without being overwhelmed and upset by them, but to tell a meaningful story about them, that capacity is a capacity of language called reflective functioning or mentalization. And there are all kinds of mentalization-based treatments that aim to cultivate that skill.
Right.
And that is a large part of what we mean by resilience. The resilience literature before we advanced that idea said that intelligence is part of resilience, that the social network you have is part of resilience. That's true too. And reflective functioning and mentalization is big words, but we see it in 15-year-olds who haven't been to university yet. I see signs of it in children.
Hmm.
The problem for children when a bad thing happens, they tend to blame themselves because they don't want to be angry with the parents. John Bowlby said children make every effort to maintain thinking of their mother as good. But what if mother behaves badly? What if mother is grieving over the loss of her own mother or father?
Hmm.
Is very upset and can't talk to the child about it. The child might be very spooked by that. Many parents in that situation will assure the children, you're not to blame. This is something that's going on in mommy and daddy and grandma, but people have to be aware that many children will carry that sense of responsibility for a traumatic event or a loss event that is not reasonable. So the way out of that is to acknowledge that it's not reasonable to have been made to feel that way.
Yeah.
Now, it may not be possible to talk to the parents who put you in that situation. They may not be alive, or you perhaps don't have the freedom to approach them with that, but you can do the work with friends, romantic partner, counselor, therapist.
Hmm.
Sometimes reading a book or watching a movie helps people, acknowledge ways to improve themselves.
Right. And so when someone has done this work and when they have improved themselves and their anxious attachment. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is they sort of are faced with a new identity. It's almost like a lot of their life has been guided by anxiety, and now that they have healed, they have improved, they have worked on it, they're discovering a lot of new things about themselves. They're discovering a lot of new things about people, about relationships, about the world. How can one then build this identity? How can they deal with this new understanding of themselves and the world?
Well, it will depend on the individual and the route they've taken to get to that new understanding. It might have been through some new romantic relationship that's very meaningful and supportive, though they might want to hold on to that and not lose that relationship if at all possible. Or maybe it was work done with a counselor or a therapist. They might want to, check in occasionally with the counselor or therapist. Some counselors and therapists have long-term relationships with their clients or their patients that go on for decades.
Yeah.
So I think it's like physical fitness. If you want to stay physically fit, at least 2-3 times a week, you've got to engage in vigorous exercise. And people do that. And actually, it sends endorphins off in the brain. People get addicted to exercise. People have to also get addicted to emotional fitness, which means 2 or 3 times a week, making space for a deep, special, open-ended conversation with the people you care about. Find out what's going on for them in their life. What are they worried about? Can they be helped cope with their worries, and maybe share some of the worries that you're dealing with that you would appreciate some advice for? I can't emphasize too much the challenge of thinking back to our childhoods, because who we are as adults is influenced by our childhood experiences. And there's a lot of attention these days to lifting up marginalized and underrepresented groups. And the largest worldwide group of marginalized, undervalued, and underrepresented, misunderstood individuals, that largest group is children under the age of 18 or under the age of 12 or under the age of 3. Far too many are living in poverty, with food insecurity, without the capacity to develop, establish, maintain secure attachments. I mean, I'm of the view that secure attachment is an intense social justice issue, because when children are securely attached, they thrive at school, they achieve to their full potential, they have meaningful relationships at home and outside of the home. Those are gifts. And children who do not have available a secure attachment, they're deprived of those gifts. I mean, by the same token, there's a lot of talk about the Me Too movement and sexual harassment and sexual abuse of people less powerful. In the university where I work, a lot of training to make sure that we treat students with respect. When a professor engages in abusive behavior toward a student, not only is it a wrong, morally wrong and legally wrong encounter and an exploitation of power, but it deprives the student of the right they have to education, to enjoy the experience of being a student. And that's deprived of some people who have suffered abuse at the hands of teachers. So I think we need to sensitize ourselves to children. And if we can do that, we will know how to behave in close romantic relationships.
Because they know as well, given that they have been given the opportunity to develop that secure attachment.
Yeah, I mean, John Bowlby, if I can, we're running out of time, but John Bowlby said repeatedly, a society that values its children must cherish their parents. I mean, we live in a very paradoxical time where women's reproductive health is the subject of government. And the people who advocate for that control of women's reproductive health are the same people who say there should be less government in our lives. There's something very strange there. And fine, you want to outlaw abortion, but then provide resources to new parents. Don't hesitate to provide housing and food and opportunity to parents. But of course, we live in a very upside down world in America where there is not consistency in the support that society offers children and women who bear children. Just very, very poor, impoverished levels of understanding and support in that domain.
Yeah.
So let's finish with the physically fit, emotionally fit idea, devote as much energy and attention to your feelings as you do to your physical body. And good things will follow from that, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good metaphor. I do think I agree that we should take care of our mental health in the same way we do our physical health, because it's a consistent thing.
I'll say one other thing. There's a lot of interest these days, and some couples therapists talk about polyamorous relationships and why should we be limited. Of course, sexuality works differently in men and women. Men are aroused by the sight of a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Women typically are aroused by the sight of somebody who might be a safe, reliable partner who could look after their children in the long term. So there are different arousal processes in men and women. And when we settle on one long-term relationship with another partner, then that whole area of concern is off the table.
Mm.
We're limited attentional capacity processors. If we settle the reproductive fitness question, we settle with a partner on some long-term relationship, we can then turn our attention to other things.
Mm.
Work, looking after family members, looking after children. So I have no trouble suggesting that, like other mammals, the human capacity for monogamy is a good thing. I'm not telling people to stay in relationships if they're not working. You heard me say, get out if you can. But if it's working, celebrate.
Yeah.
Celebrate the idea of sleeping with the same person many hundreds of times, rather than being addicted to the idea that you have to sleep with 600 different people.
Yeah.
That's the addiction to love, is focusing exclusively on the passion and the romance. And when that's gone, someone looks for another new relationship. But actually, that person who's jumping around, going from one romantic relationship to another, is not allowing themselves the privilege of discovering what a multi-dimensional, complex, and full long-term relationship can be.
And that's even more true for people who have anxious attachment, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, the person with anxious attachment or avoidant attachment, that's the challenge for them.
Mm-hmm.
So roll up their sleeves and face the inner demons. And in the process, find someone that you can have a long-term relationship with. Someone that you, sure enough, you enjoy sleeping with, but someone that you enjoy talking to in the morning.
Yeah.
At breakfast. 1 year, 10 years, and 20 years plus after establishing the relationship. If you don't have that common interest at breakfast, then it's not going to last.
Yeah. Dr. Steele, I would love to hear more, but we're almost running out of time. So I'm going to leave it with one more question. Do you have any final thoughts on the topic, on anxious attachment, on love addiction, on healing?
I mean, I go back to that question. Think about what you do when you're upset. You need to have a lot of different strategies. And one of them ought to be that you can tell your romantic partner about what you're upset about. And if you feel that you're unable to share your upset with the romantic partner, think about what's going on. Think about whether this is a relationship that you want to stay in for the long term, or do you want to try and bring about some change? And you may get change in the relationship with that partner. You want to stay with them. You may discover you need to seek out a new relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That's deep personal work that we all have to do.
Yeah. And it's really about being in that relationship that brings us the security as well. So a part of being kind to ourselves is acknowledging that it's not always just us, but it's also dynamic. It's the relationship, and that can bring about a lot of change and security, but we do have to start with ourselves as well.
Through praise is a big part of it. Praise of one's own efforts, praise of the partner. People respond very well to positive emotion. We're talking to one another, we're nodding up and down. If I start going like this, it's going to make you very uneasy.
Right.
We want to affirm one another. We want to share positive emotion, and we should do just that. So, there's a colleague who talks about savoring relationships because they're the most valuable thing in our human lives. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steele. This has been amazing. I appreciate all the insights you've shared. And it was a pleasure.
Good luck to you and your listeners. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. All right. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for watching this video of me interviewing Dr. Howard Steele. Dr. Howard is one of the world's foremost researchers on attachment, and I learned a lot from him about that during this talk, so I hope that you did as well. Now, if you feel like you are experiencing anxious attachment and you would like a little bit of help and support in working through it and healing it, then I would love for you to join Love Addicts. We are a safe community of people with anxious attachment, and we have psychologists and coaches inside the community who can provide you with support and direct feedback and advice on your specific situation whenever it's needed. We also have a lot of courses on developing self-worth, building your self-esteem, regulating your emotions, setting boundaries, building healthy relationships and maintaining them, as well as feeling lovable and valuable in yourself, and a lot more. And finally, we have multiple sessions each week in which our psychologists and our coaches go live, and you can go live with them and you can ask questions, and they talk about anxious attachment, and you can get direct feedback in those live sessions about your situation as well. So if you would like to join Love Addicts, then go to our website, loveaddicts.com, go through the page, and at the bottom there's an attachment quiz that you could fill out. If your answers are in line with anxious attachment, then you will receive an invite to join. So go to the page, take the quiz, and I hope that I get to see you inside. All right, thank you.